Hello. I'm going to be talking about modern railways and rituals at two different points, and then there's a bunch of other stuff in the middle as well. I'm going to start off with some fundamental definitions because I think it's going to be useful for what we're talking about. So we're going to take medium as meaning a means of communication. So in that definition, all of these would constitute media or would sit within that definition, whether you've got Paul Revere on the midnight run riding across to pass the information about the English arriving, whether you've got North Korean TV or you've got these like brazier things, which if you've seen Lord of the Rings, Gondor calls for aid, way is very exciting. That's all along the south coast in the UK. You go and see them. Whether you're talking about Pravda or all of these various different devices over here, all of these are ways of collapsing distance to bring people closer together and to transmit information on a range which isn't available under normal circumstances. That's why we've got all of this chutney over here, because there's a load of people who can't be here, but now they can because we're bringing them closer. So this sits under what James Carey talks about as the transmission model for communication, which is a process whereby messages are transmitted and distributed in space for the control of distance and people. I bring you closer to me, I give you information, information meaning to give form, and I shape your thinking, I shape your behavior and attitudes and your culture and so on. You can see the distribution of Christianity across the world as an example of this with missionaries and with the kind of spread, and you can think about it from a colonial perspective as well. The main thing here is that that's one way and possibly an easier way of thinking about communication. There are other ways of thinking about it, which Carey talks about as well, which I'll be coming on to. But before I go to that, I just want to talk briefly about technology. So if we're going to define technology, hopefully this isn't too controversial definition and no one's going to jump, no way. Surely, hopefully everyone's happy that I've accommodated everything that they do within these few short words. So if we're thinking about technology as the application of scientific knowledge and principles to create tools, systems, solutions, and so on, I'm not going to give you examples of technology, but I do want to talk a little bit about technologies. So when we're talking about technology, we have to decide if we're talking about the incredible new idea that somebody comes up with, or when that technology starts to impact on social processes, on behaviors, on culture, and start to kind of lead out into content and start to actually have an impact. If you do two timelines, one for when different technologies were invented and one for when they start to matter, they're usually about 30, 40, sometimes 50 years apart. So television sits around for ages before it's of any real significance. Film a little bit faster. So we can think about technology in that term. We can also think about it in terms of bisociation, which I talked to a couple of people about already, where two different planes of thought intersect and create a new idea. So a particular technology, a creative activity, and that creates that lock in the middle of it. So if we're talking about the importance of technology or define the significance of technology, we can think about it as Postman talks about it in Technopoly. I'm pretty sure it's from Technopoly, not amusing ourselves to death. Pretty sure it's Technopoly, about the idea that the uses made of any technology are largely determined by the structure of the technology itself. So the functions follow from the forms. It's a kind of throwaway comment that's incredibly important and just sort of disappears into the flow of the wider argument. Essentially, the idea is that smoke signals can convey a certain kind and depth and complexity of information in the same way as the written word can or a computer can. You can go to Barth and the idea that the chemists invented photography because they devised the process by which photography could happen, and then photographers worked out how to use those processes. So we can think about this in terms of coming up with these functions, and then they define the forms and the shapes and the behaviors. That's quite a kind of techno-determinist way of thinking about it rather than a social determinist way of thinking about it. You can also think about it, as Clay Christensen talked about it, as the idea of disruptive innovations being technologically straightforward, consisting of off-the-shelf components put together in a product architecture that was often simpler than prior approaches. It's not about an incredible new technology you've come up with. It's normally a bunch of pre-existing bits that you jam together and you call it Netflix, and suddenly you're a huge multi-billion-dollar business and everything else is collapsing around you. So it's very rare that it's a new technology which completely changes behaviors and activities. It's much more likely that lots of pre-existing bits and pieces are pulled together into a useful and interesting thing that make people get excited and makes people want to use them. Edison said that we'll make electricity so cheap that only the rich will buy candles, and it's about the cheapness of the components and the ease of access as opposed to the invention of the technologies themselves. So in this respect, in some ways, you think about things like VR. I'm trying to talk about VR for once because I always come here and talk about hypertext, and I feel like I should suck in your direction. In that respect, you can think about VR as being a game changer. It's cheaper on the Apple side. It's better than existing hardware. Those exciting innovations that go with it. I do have questions about it. One of them is what it's disrupting. We were talking at lunch about, with most technologies, you can draw a line between it's where it starts in theatre, then it becomes, well, let's capture theatre and make it something you can watch, and then let's make the screen smaller and in your pocket. And you can normally draw a line between the home office of, you know, the 19th century and the home office today, and understand why these things go through these diskeuomorphic processes and how they're connected to each other. If I try and work backwards from VR, I'm working into now, like I'm in a world, and then you put a world on top of my world, and I can't really see that causal chain. And that's one of the kind of questions that I've got, one of the things that I'd like to talk about. My question is it a kind of magnificent platform in search of a purpose that we know it should be for something? Come on, everyone, use it, please, but they don't seem to want to. But it's so good, just get on with it. So this is where it brings me to Carey's other form of communication, which is ritual communication. So in Carey's words, if the archetypal case of communication under the transmission view is the extension of messages across geography for the purpose of control, so closing distance, bringing people closer so you can put information into their brains and shape their thinking and behaviors, then ritual is about a ceremony that draws people together in fellowship and commonality. You learn nothing by seeing this cartoon about how bankers' bonuses, etc., and French bankers' bonuses, but you do get a sense of, we're all part of a common xenophobic community that hate finance, or isn't it warm fuzzies of xenophobia. So at the same time, when you have a royal wedding, for example, that's a ritual event. You learn nothing by somebody having a baby or getting married, but there's a feeling that you're part of a community, you're part of something that you kind of pulled together. So the transmission model is about passing information to others and shaping. Ritual is about coming together. I think about watching the Generation Game with my parents every now and again. For those, remember the Generation Game? And like, I didn't gain much from it, except that it was a sense of family, a sense of community, a sense of coming together, a group of people who didn't spend that much time together, but we forced ourselves to come and sit and watch a not great game show on TV. So we're thinking about ritual. Ritual is this idea of coming together of people for a sacred moment, which is what makes this seem so ludicrous to me when I sat and watched through the advert saying, come on, guys, sit on your own in the dark. Yeah. And it's this one right in the middle where there's a dad playing with his kids, and he thinks, if only I had a big screen over my eyes so I could play with them more better. Again, I think there's a lot of this kind of closing the gap. The most recent video of Meta showed Zuck and a tame journalist going, wow, it's like your face is in front of me, but your face is already in front of me. And so I get promoting VR on transmission. I totally understand that idea of we can have meetings all the time now. Don't worry, don't go to bed, come and have a meeting. So I get the idea of closing the gap. That's great. And I get the idea of VR doing that because it does do that. But it's trickier to sell the ritual side of VR, which is not to say that it's actually impossible. I think that actually VR is great for these kind of ritual activities. And I think that's what they did really well with iPads when they were showing, you know, grandparents seeing children that had just been born on the other side of the world. Like, I definitely see the ritual argument for it. It has the potential to be this, a device for the transmission of information, but also a mechanism and a medium for sharing and also for coming together. So I've kind of close this with a huge quote for no particularly good reason, just so you want something to look at while I talk for a bit. Originally this was highlighted, but it disappeared when it switched over to Keynote. So the two main parts here are the first line of each of these first two paragraphs. That in one sense, when we're thinking about media communications and media businesses and so on, they're unique because they are our means of accessing our culture, our means of accessing communication. They're how rituals take place. They're how you bring people together around a kind of common idea. So in one sense, media businesses are unique. They're not something which you find anywhere else. And in other sense, they're just businesses. They have shareholders. And I'm almost done. No question. So in another sense, they are just businesses. And I think often there's this conflict between the incredible new technologies on one side, but also their role as kind of communication and content tools and so on. So I think enthusiasts like those who build model railways or play Minecraft just love the idea of something and want you to like it too. Come and see my model railway. Come and see my Minecraft world. And if you don't like model railways, or you don't like Minecraft, or whatever they're enthusiastic about, it's quite hard to sell it to them because it's just cool. You want to say, VR is just so cool. Why don't you understand? And it's because they don't approach it from this is so cool. They approach it from what's it cool for me? So how do we get people from the wow of things like VR to the why of things like VR? And that's the question which has words that kind of rhyme a little bit, which is a good way of finishing, that I'm going to leave with. I'm done. Exactly 5 minutes. Well done, me.
All right. Okay.
Thanks.
So before questions, I will address that in one specific way because it's a very provocative and it's absolutely perfect question. The whole what is VR, we spent a lot of time on, and now we don't care. Now it is the things in VR. So I'm interested, for instance, in how to have a graph on the wall over there. VR in itself is irrelevant. And this was very much taught by Fabian, who said, use a projector. You know, that's also VR. We're talking about extended environments. So the shift from the medium to the things in the medium is becoming interesting.
You really should have moved. You had a chance. You just
I kept back and thinking, okay, you're saying that the tools shape the way that the rituals are happening, also how we communicate and what are the ideas that we share with others, right? But early on we were like taking this Obsidian tool, and FoT said that it's interesting to also think that maybe the tools are shaping ourselves to how we communicate with each other, how that help us to communicate with each other. So I don't know, how are your thoughts on that part?
Yeah, so that's one view as well. We were talking a little bit about the kind of mall approach that's often taken, that you know, you put people into a mall with a bunch of apps and you say this is a virtual world, and what we kind of forget is that the initial stages were that you kind of slowly lowered people into it. You got them excited about being able to take photographs and be able to see them straight away on a screen, and then you very slowly integrate them into an ecosystem and you slowly bring in the other kind of applications and so on. And so I think there's a kind of slow process of integrating people into things where people do start to accept and engage with and absorb things. But we were talking a bit about the Everett Rogers graph. I think that's such an interesting point that we're at right now, because I think most people know what this technology is. Like, it's not a mystery. We're not in the early adopters necessarily. We're in a point where either it becomes universal or it becomes a kind of interesting hobbyist activity. And so I think this has now handed over to us. It has handed over to people, and we're trying to sell getting involved with it and getting excited about it. And I think it is still something which struggles to go outside people who just get it immediately. And it's how you get that bit where you say, here's why it's better than, because what I get from a lot of people is they say, well, why not just use a keyboard? Keyboards are great. Why not just use a screen? Screens are great. I've got a printer. Like, we were talking a bit about Office 365 and how nobody telling on, but London Fire Brigade is entirely made up of people who download files, edit those files, and email them to people, because they just don't like the idea that a file is just nowhere. They like to have it in their hands, and ideally it would be a printout, which is what everyone does. They print off the PDF, annotate it, and then hand it to somebody. So I think there's a real long tail of this, and if you're trying to just make a big push, it's really hard, and really hard to convince people to get over that initial, well, what's it replacing? Because what you're saying is it's not really replacing anything, but if you all use it, we'll work out what it's replacing.
One last little bit. Is there any technology that had this big impact, like you were just describing? Like, okay, here's the technology. Like, I just imagine cars. Hey, this is the car. We can use it.
Telephone.
All the forces. Okay, it wasn't weird.
I think. I mean, it's interesting. Ordinarily, with these kind of things, you see a long crossover process. So like the Magic Lantern, for example, which was a kind of Victorian parlor entertainment where you would project light through a glass slide and it would shine onto a screen. The crossover between film and Magic Lantern is actually enormous. It's about 50 years where Magic Lanterns are still being used in various different ways, particularly because they were considered to be superior, because film couldn't do color, for example. So there's a whole crossover period as one technology replaces another technology. And I think that's one of the challenges, is it's hard to integrate this into other aspects of daily life. If I'm sitting watching TV with 3 people and one of them's got a headset that's got their subtitles right there, and they're like, you guys don't even know, my subtitles are so good. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm watching TV with my friends and eating Pringles. Like, unless your headset can put the Pringles in my mouth, I don't see what I'm getting from it. So I think there is
an opportunity.
One day, I'm pitching ideas. So if anyone wants to acknowledge my Pringles device,
Next to you, put it in the Pringles.
but I would just say, I think that's one of the tricky things. I mean, the crossover between like horses and cars is also huge. And even with the Model T Ford, which is a good example of disruptive innovation, there's still a long crossover where you still have a whole range of different other conveyances which slowly replace the vehicle. So I don't think it's ever that simple, and I think it's just accepting this yeah, exactly, accepting this process and accepting that for a long time it's a novelty, and then it might get integrated when people work out how it gets integrated.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I had a double espresso earlier on, so now I feel I can talk to you at your own level. Right? So yeah,
Hold it and slow it down for a minute.
Yeah, so I thought it was really interesting, very provocative, and the idea of kind of those ritual interactions kind of captures, I think, some of the unease around VR really nicely. I was thinking though about the kind of the wider XR space, and in particular, I did work in mixed reality. And in mixed reality, you have the potential there that you have a technology that enables new types of shared connection. Because what you can do is let's say you're playing a mixed reality game in a space with a group. You and the other members of that group are in a quite tangible way in a different space than other people there. Right? So the technology is facilitating your connection in a way.
Yeah.
And so does that follow? Do you think there's potential in the broader sort of XR spectrum for doing those kinds of things?
I think that's a really good use case for it, and I think it sits quite nicely in that kind of slightly old-fashioned vision of games as kind of defining a space within which there's a set of rules. And I think that's always been a great way of thinking about it. And I think you could probably scale that to other spaces as well, because it's been talked about as a model for, you know, judicial process as well, that within a judicial context there are some things you can take into account and some things you can't. And I think if you're going to define a space in which that interaction takes place, I think that's great. I think the challenge is to model something which people want. And I think one of the difficulties, particularly in this kind of space, is when you ask people what they want. We were again talking about this at lunch. What is it that you want to model? Somebody was saying, you know, would it be useful to be able to look at somebody and see all their interests and their favorite films and that kind of thing? And I feel like that's like, for people who find dating uncomfortable, wouldn't it be great if I could just like cheat and like look at all your social media, find out your favorite film, go, hey, do you like, my example is Greek hip hop, and you're like, yeah, I do like Greek, you know. So it's whether what you're modeling is a way of kind of bypassing difficult social interactions, or you're enhancing an experience that everybody wants to be part of in the first place. And again, that's this idea of a kind of universal technology versus something which has specific applications. I think that's kind of what you're talking about, which is moving into where it sits and finding people who can get excited about one particular thing it's doing rather than all the things it's replacing. Makes sense?
Yeah, you have to sit in this question. Yeah.
It's awful, isn't it? Because it feels like it's gained such weight as you walk over towards the special chair.
I really like your idea of the ritual. I think you're onto something there. And what entered my mind was this summer in my local park, they had this Pokemon convention. So people came from all over the world, and they all got into a local park, which, you know, got some protests from the. But they are literally, I'm walking through the park, walking around just like this. So basically, they're participating in a ritual.
Yeah,
Which I know it goes to the mixed reality, but it's ritualistic enough to stimulate that if next year someone says, but actually we're going to use headsets,
I think
you've got your
yeah,
catchment audience.
that's a great example. And I was thinking about, you know, that thing about golf being a good walk ruined, but I think it's one of those things that people need a reason to go for a nice walk with their friends, so you go golfing. So I think there's a way of thinking about it, that as a kind of enhancer to experience. And I think that's a great example of exactly that thing.
Yeah, and it was struck by you mentioning the royal and talking about it as we, like, if you're not actually a royalist, it's not something that it's
absolutely
just an illusion.
Yeah,
but again, it's that thing, if you've got enough people to subscribe to something.
And I think that the interesting thing with Kerry is that he talked about the idea of being anti-royalist as being ritual in itself. Like, I think there's definitely, you know, as somebody spends a lot of time in left-wing circles having left-wing conversations, like there's a slightly performative aspect of being somebody who says, well, we all hate this, and it's quite nice to be part of a group because you feel so hemmed in sometimes to be able to say, well, I'm sitting in a room full of people who all agree with me, and that feels good. So I think that ritual doesn't have to be around something that is. It can be around something that isn't as well. But no, really, that's great. Thank you.
I went to the coronation, you know.
Really?
Separate conversation. Hang on, Mark, you're coming up at Brandel, so we don't forget the other side. But we have to really, you know, spin the wheels now. Brandel, please.
So from the perspective, you can hear me okay in the room now?
Yes.
Terrific. That's amazing. So from the perspective of, you know, there being some technologies that appear to be clear references and I'm sorry, replacements for other things, versus things that appear to be sort of solutions chasing problems. I can say hand on heart that that analysis, even from the interior of the organizations that are responsible for creating those things, can only be happen after the fact, significantly after the fact. So iPad, iPhone, Apple Watch, all of these mobile phones and things like that. If you look at the original messaging, the original positioning, they're accurate reflections of what people thought they were going to be at the time. And so it's actually never the case that there is some kind of preordained path that these things are on, and the sort of priorities and values that they come to occupy. So that those aren't necessarily forthcoming within the virtual reality space is not a unique indictment of it, but rather a reflection of the point that we are in history with it. But I am excited for that solution, for that sort of process to kind of become further resolved.
And you're the only one in the room who actually has the headset, so we have to bow to your expertise. Mark, you had a quick question, and well, Fabienne, you get 3 words or less.
So it's a quick observation more. Think back to this thing about saying, well, is VR a solution, an idea looking, as for something to do? An alternate publication comes some time spent in the Cabinet Office a while back on a comment with a group that were doing retention of documents. And the fact that the first digitally native documents have reached that point, and there is no process that doesn't depend on a print era to do it. And now we're drowning in vast quantity of data. When you look at things like soft space environment as shown earlier, maybe, just maybe, that's one way that we can actually, so maybe it's just arrived at the right time. We don't know exactly what it is, but it possibly is a solution to something we really need to do, and we should have started doing earlier.
Very good. Thanks very much. That's good.
I'll obviously cheat, but it's okay. No, I gave a workshop last weekend with kids. They were 11 to 12 years old. We did VR. The whole ritual was let's play. That was it. There was no further thought. It was let's play. Let's do the thing. I'm not saying it's might be a general show thing, but the mindset of let's just go at it. Let's try. That's completely different than in other contexts.
It's more than 3 words.
That's slightly. I don't know how to count. So
Thank you. And now we're going to move over to Keiichi, one of the very latest members, if I can loosely call it that, of the community. He will be presenting on his own screen, as you see. We're going to pause 30 seconds for coffee. I completely agree with that priority. Coffee and water. Anyone else want a quick?
In person.
One question.
I don't think they can hear us, Teresa.
Oh, okay.
No, we can hear.
Let's wait.
Yeah, we can hear.
We were wondering if we can present soon because we have to leave earlier.
Oh, okay. So that we asked earlier if there was anybody online who wanted to present, and we didn't see anything.
Because we read it later. We just answered.
That's fine. You can go straight after this presentation. Will that be okay?
Yes.
Now that we have a speaker and everything. Okay, fantastic.